Hello everyone, we've got a lot to get through today, so let's get straight to the latest POFMA'ed. All of you may remember that during the Thum Ping Tjin trial last year, former Workers' Party cadre member Yudhithira Nathan testified about the deletion of messages from a group chat because they were scared that they were being spied on or hacked. We also know that Sylvia Lim, Kirsten Han, Terry Shi and others have received notices from Apple and Facebook that they may have been targeted by state-sponsored actors. In response to Sylvia's question, then Minister for Law and Minister for Home Affairs K. Shanmugam, seen here explaining that yes, you are free to speak your mind in Singapore as long as it's exactly what's already on his mind, said that her phone was not hacked by Singapore state agencies but also went out of his way to refuse to say if they had ever hacked anyone else's phone or planned to hack her phone or anyone else's phone in the future.
Normal practice that we take is that we do not confirm or deny. So I do not intend in future to confirm or deny.
So, we know the Singapore state did not hack Sylvia's phone before 18 February 2022. But has it hacked her phone or any phone since? Shan has made it clear he will not say. So, is the PAP government spying on us? Let's find out! It is a fact that the Singapore government routinely surveils the phones or communications of opposition politicians or political activists. It is a fact that the Singapore government uses surveillance software such as Pegasus, FinSpy, Quadream or other similar software to spy on its own citizens for political, non-criminal purposes. It is a fact that the Singapore government routinely shares data derived from spying on its own citizens with other governments, and it is a fact that the Singapore government enables the transfer of spyware to other Southeast Asian governments and entities. I Spy with My Little Eye, a show starting with T. It's the show with PJ Thum. Hello everyone! Today we'll talk about race and how it's managed in Singapore, and in particular how race is not about race in Singapore, it's about money and power. So to start, does this look familiar to you?
At 5 p.m, scuffles were witnessed at the junction of Kallang Road and Kampong Supu between Chinese bystanders and Malay marchers. To this day, nobody knows exactly how the riot started. What is known is there was a sudden surge in emotions. Fights broke out along Geylang Road between Chinese and Malays.
If you're born from around 1990 onwards, you will know the events of 21st July 1964 as race riots, and you will have grown up celebrating Racial Harmony Day, which falls on the anniversary of those riots. But here's the strange thing. The riots happened in 1964. Racial Harmony Day was instituted in 1997. If race was such a volatile issue, why the delay? Why wait 33 years? Because the riots weren't actually race riots. They were political riots which manipulated race as an issue for political gain. Why did the scuffles break out here? Because in the previous 2 years, there had been hugely controversial forced land clearances in the Kallang area where Malay villagers were kicked off their land so that it could be turned into industrial land. There's a term for kicking indigenous people off their land so you can sell it to capitalists for profit that those indigenous people will never receive. It's called colonialism. And when it is done by your own elected government which had promised to protect your land rights, it's called betrayal. I discussed the issue of the collectivization of land in Singapore in the previous episode. But you can see why the Malays at that time in that area were so pissed off and responded so strongly to accusations from Kuala Lumpur that the PAP government was betraying Singapore's Malays. Now, this was well known and understood at the time. So Lee Kuan Yew and the PAP and Tun Razak and UMNO blamed each other for manipulating Malay unhappiness to instigate the riots. But they both agreed that the riots were not racially motivated. Lee said at the time, quote, "There is no real antagonism between the Malays and the Chinese. The whole thing has been cuffed up." And the official report of the Singapore government that was submitted to the Commission of Inquiry into the riots stated that the riots, quote, "were not a spontaneous and unwilled manifestation of genuine animosities between the races, but had been deliberately provoked. They were willed by irresponsible and reckless propaganda based on falsehoods and distortion of facts in a systemic and sustained effort to work up communal disaffection and racial and religious hatred among the Malays in order to further the political objectives of certain communal extremists. Their principal purpose," argued the Singapore submission, "was to, quote, re-establish the political influence of UMNO among the Singapore Malays," unquote, and another was to, quote, "use the Singapore Malays as pawns to consolidate Malay support for UMNO in Malaya," unquote. And for 33 years, that was the official line of the PAP government. Not race riots, but political riots which manipulated race for political purposes. So why did they change the story in 1997? If you've been watching the show for a while, you're going to know the answer. Yes. In 1991, new Prime Minister Goh Chok Tong lost a then unprecedented 4 seats in Parliament. He then spent the next term of office running scared that he would lose even more seats at the next election, including to JB Jeyaretnam. The PAP had fixed him up in 1986 and kicked him out of Parliament, but JBJ would be able to run for Parliament again in 1997. So a terrified Goh Chok Tong pulled out all sorts of dirty tricks to win the 1997 election. One of the PAP's tactics was to rewrite history. They aimed to provoke fear among Singaporeans by creating a sense of fragility in our society so that people would run back to the PAP. Another aim was to use race as an excuse to crack down on anyone who disagreed with the PAP. This is a line that they continue to use today, as we saw when our dear friend Shanmugam, seen here proving that even without hair, he's very good at splitting them, when he introduced the new Maintenance of Racial Harmony Act earlier this year.
When Singapore gained independence, the issues relating to racial relations were fresh in the minds of the first generation of leaders. The proximate cause were the racial riots of 1964, and at that time, communal tensions were very high in both Singapore and Malaysia. On 21 July 1964, riots started. That was during a procession to celebrate Prophet Muhammad's birthday.
Bald, a dash. That's not what Lee Kuan Yew said in 1964. So Shan is again using fear of a genuine problem, just like he did for fake news, for foreign intervention and so on, as an excuse to regulate and crack down on Singaporeans. But the reason why Shan has had to introduce these new laws in Singapore is because race policy has become both intertwined with and in conflict with the PAP's economic policy, and this is causing all sorts of problems that the PAP can't cope with, which is why the PAP is on a new offensive to silence discussion about race. So let's start with the big picture. If you watch the show regularly, then you may realize that understanding the general framework of PAP policy is actually pretty straightforward. As I said in episode 3, in order to understand 95% of Singapore's history under the PAP, we just need to ask 2 simple questions that the PAP asks themselves. First, how do we, the PAP, keep the economy of Singapore growing? And second, how do we, the PAP, keep ourselves in power? Basically, every PAP policy is directed towards both these aims, and if it doesn't fulfill both these aims, they usually don't do it. But what happens if the right policy cannot fulfill both aims? Also, Recall that when the PAP came into power in 1959, it was a radical socialist party and sought to reform society, and so it built a lot of levers that allow it to reach deeply into people's lives. It has more power over its people than most governments, except maybe North Korea. Through all these mechanisms, the PAP is able to control or influence or constrain where you live, who you marry, how many children you have, where those children go to school, what kind of healthcare you receive, how much you pay for that healthcare, how much you pay for your house, and whether or not to grant you one of the endless series of permits that you need to go about life in Singapore. The same framework and mechanisms also apply to race. The PAP historically manages race primarily to keep itself in power, but increasingly race management is conflicting with economic growth, and that is producing even more problems. What the PAP does not do is manage race to actually reflect how Singaporeans live and experience race. It's almost two different things. So, the first of the PAP's two overarching goals is to grow Singapore's economy as much as possible as measured by GDP. As I discussed in Season 2, Episode 3 and 4, Singapore's economic model is based on what economists call an extensive growth model, where GDP growth is achieved primarily by stuffing Singapore with more capital and labour. It's like the French-American bakery at Haji Lane. You know, they went viral for their hot chocolate. They want to make more money. So what do? Open more outlets so they sell more croissants. So now they are at Taka, Tampines, VivoCity, Cold Storage. But to do that, they need to raise more capital, hire more bakers, buy more ovens, invest more money. The problem is that this typically leads to diminishing returns over time, with more and more inputs required to produce a given quantity of output, because ultimately, there's only so many croissants you can sell. And inevitably, some of your investments don't work out. But another way to make more money is to find ways to make more profits for the same input. You take Queen Aman. You add some Biscoff to the top. It's only a few extra pennies in cost, but you can sell it for 1.5 times the price. Or you find ways to make each baker more efficient. Maybe invent a faster oven or teach bakers a quicker method. But the PAP has really failed at making the economy more innovative. Again, I covered all this in episodes 3 and 4, and now I really want a croissant. Hold on, be right back. Okay, so where was I? Okay, so the PAP's economic model requires stuffing Singapore with more workers. The easiest people to exploit are foreign workers because they are not citizens. They cannot vote. They have no rights. Singapore has stuffed ourselves with around 1.4 million foreign low-wage workers who are heavily underpaid, heavily exploited, who are basically taxed at extortionate rates between 35 to 50% because the money that should be paid to them from their employers is instead paid to the government as the foreign worker levy. We also have around 465,000 high-wage foreign workers. Now, ask yourself, what race are all these foreign workers? Does it matter? And if so, why does it matter? The race of those foreign workers matters because the second of the PAP's overarching goals is to stay in power. And to do this, it seeks to preserve social stability, because if society changes under the PAP can quickly become outdated or irrelevant and lose power. I explained the race model back in Season 1 in the very first episode of the show, but here's a quick recap. The PAP government follows the same model as the colonial government, which is fundamentally bureaucratization of race. The Chinese, Malay, Indian, others, or CMIO model forces every Singaporean to have a race. Now, the British ran Singapore as a business for profit. That's where our CMIO race model comes from. The British put us into boxes that were convenient for them. Which box you wanted to be in did not matter. All that matters is that once you are shoved into a box, the government can just treat every single person in that box the same way. So instead of having to govern hundreds of thousands of individual people, they just had to govern 4 boxes. Cheap, easy. The PAP government has largely adhered to that model, but also politicized it to a great extent as part of its goals.
But for the purposes of policy administration, these races are categorized into 4 groups based on the size of the communities: Chinese, Malay, Indian, and others.
Today, under the CMIO model, your race is highly determinative of how you are treated by the state, including housing, education, welfare, and your participation in politics. For example, your race determines which organization is able to provide welfare to you. Your race determines where you can buy government-subsidized housing. Your race determines what language you learn in school. Your race also determines your political rights, since the PAP limits certain officers by race. But remember, you do not get to decide your own race for yourself. The government approves your application to be part of a race through an appointed committee. And because the PAP desires stability in Singapore, it has sought to maintain Singapore's racial demography at roughly the same level. 75% Chinese, 50% Malay, 9% Indian, 1% other. The logic is that if the racial ratios change, this would undermine social stability and also the PAP's rule. We have seen this in European countries, often as a legacy of colonialism, where the racial ratios change, contributing to a rise of a nativist or xenophobic movement that destabilizes the main conservative party, which in Singapore is of course the PAP. But those ratios only count citizens and residents, not the foreign workers who comprise almost 25%. That's 1/4 of our country. So, you begin to see the problem? The real racial ratios for the people who are actually in the country are very different because those 1.4 million foreign workers are overwhelmingly from South Asia, Indonesia, the Philippines, and China. So the economic policy is working against the social policy by rapidly changing society in ways which may undermine PAP hegemony. And the PAP government literally says, oh, it's okay, they're not citizens, they don't count. But that's the mindset that led to the COVID disaster when our healthcare system failed to take migrant workers into account, and so COVID ran riot in the worker dormitories. Those people are human beings. They breathe the air we breathe, they eat the food we eat, they deserve dignity and respect. But our government encourages us to think of them as disposable, less than human, as goods to be shipped in lorries and hidden away in dormitories so we don't think about them. Out of sight, out of mind. Until, of course, a bloody massive sinkhole opens up, or a shop house catches fire and they jump in to save another human being, and then for one day they get to be human and are given a commemorative coin each. And the Straits Times couldn't even get their names right and had to be corrected. Wow, what gratitude! Good job, Ministry of Manpower. Come, I clap for you. And on top of this, we have plunging birth rates, but the different races have different birth rates. All this has combined to create honestly really weird set of policies. So, in essence, the PAP is so obsessed with preserving this arbitrary race ratio, they then have to artificially import more people of specific races to make up for unequal birth rates with little regard for how those new immigrants actually fit into the country. So look at what happened. In 1990, we had around 3 million residents, of which 2.6 million were citizens. In 2024, we have 6 million residents, but only 3.6 million are citizens. In the 2025 general election, we only had about 2.75 million voters. Less than half the country can vote, and as I mentioned before, half of the voters don't care about politics, so our elections have become basically the world's most expensive condo management committee AGM. But in 34 years, we doubled our resident population but only increased our citizens by around 1/3. And our birth rate has also plunged from 1.83 in 1990 to 0.97 in 2024. So how did we gain so many citizens? Well, the government has naturalized citizens at a very high rate. And in order to artificially preserve the race ratio, the PAP has had to significantly naturalize more Chinese people, especially those from Malaysia, but more recently those from the PRC, and Indian people, because of the lower birth rates among those races. So in 1990, we naturalized 7,600 new citizens while we had 35,900 more births and deaths, but by 2024, this had basically reversed. Natural population growth was just 7,300, but naturalization was 26,400 people. One consequence which I've talked about is that Singapore is hugely crowded, and this has driven up the cost of living and placed a lot of strain on infrastructure, particularly affordable housing, public transport and healthcare. We've become a country where you queue for a queue number just to get into another queue. So when Singaporeans protest migration, we are not being xenophobic. We're protesting the PAP government's economic model, which depends on stuffing Singapore full of people who are only here to be exploited. The PAP is like a baker that had one croissant that went viral decades ago. It was amazing, flaky, buttery, a miracle of post-colonial baking. But after that, they never made another successful product. No sourdough, no brioche, not even a bread loaf. It all bombed in the market. So instead of trying to innovate, they just bought out all the other bakeries, banned you from eating anywhere else, and kept shoving the same croissant at you. And if you complain, they tell you you're ungrateful, and clearly you don't understand how hard it is to run a bakery on a little red dot. Imagine if the PAP ran the French-American bakery. They'd start importing 2 million new customers from overseas just to show you how popular their croissant is, even though 1.4 million of them can't actually afford one. They'd require you to apply online for a croissant quota, prove your loyalty to the bakery, and if you complain about the taste, they'll POFMA'ed you. They'd keep the same croissant for 60 years, tell you it's the reason Singapore survived, and then say, you better be grateful. They'd say their croissant is the most popular because 65% of Singaporeans keep buying it, even though they keep arresting and suing and putting on trial all the other bakers. So what other croissant can you buy? I got a million of these. I could keep going. But that's basically our economy. The same old croissant, overcrowded bakery, imported customers who are underpaid, and the rest of us squeezed for space, butter, wages. And in the PAP's croissant, the official recipe is 75% flour, 15% butter, 9% milk, 1% sugar, a sprinkling of salt and yeast, and they are not altering it for anything. But unofficially, they add more and more unhealthy additives to keep everyone addicted. And then they say, oh, those don't count. The problem is that the PAP's required ratio recipe rests on 3 big flawed assumptions. First, it assumes that everybody fits neatly into the 4 assigned boxes, but most people don't. Race is, of course, a social construct. It's not objectively measurable. That's why the vast majority of countries do not have explicit and compulsory racial categorizations. But even if race had some biological basis, interracial marriages are common and increasing. 18.1% of marriages in 2023, up from 11.5% in 2003. We literally have an entire category of people who are defined by being mixed race. They're called Peranakans. In Singapore, one's identity is influenced by a lot of things: language, religion, cultural traditions, class, not just race. People are way more complicated than a single label. But not being able to fit neatly into one of the PAP assigned boxes really affects your life. Indian Muslims, for example, have had problems because they fall between boxes. They're not Malay, so they've been rejected from receiving welfare from Mendaki, but they're not Hindu, so they also get rejected by SINDA. It's important to clarify that this is not supposed to be the case, but it has happened often enough that MUIS and CPF both have had to come out and clarify that this is not supposed to be the case. And yes, people in each race are by default made to donate to each self-help group. Why is charity so racialized? Why not everyone just give money to the government, which then spends money to help all people who are underprivileged? We could call it, I don't know, taxes and welfare. But this problem is also compounded by the economic model. The unnatural mass naturalization since the 1990s has brought in naturalized citizens with their own notions of race, which conflict with local conceptions of race, and this is causing significant intra-ethnic tensions within the racial communities. These issues are not actually new. From the colonial period till today, there have long been tensions between English-speaking Chinese and Chinese-speaking Chinese, between Arab Muslims and Nusantara Muslims, between Northern Indians and Southern Indians. But our government keeps acting as if new naturalized citizens from China or India are going to be exactly like Chinese and Indians who are already in Singapore. China and India are very big, very diverse, very different places from Singapore. So it is recent immigrants from China or India who actually have reported the most and greatest challenges integrating with the local Chinese or Indian community, because we literally speak different languages and have different values from them. For example, in a TikTok video that went viral in May 2024, the user, who's originally from China, described how many Singaporean Chinese refused to identify as Chinese. Rather, they saw themselves as Singaporeans first, So they rejected his attempt at camaraderie on the basis of shared ancestry, and instead, many were actually offended when he labelled them as Chinese and were unhappy about someone trying to impose that label on them. Why the resentment? One issue is that these immigrants physically represent the stresses and tensions felt by Singapore society due to the government's artificially stuffing Singapore full of immigrants in order to boost the economy. Because people recognize that this drives up prices and strains infrastructure. Even Senior Minister Lee Hsien Loong was forced to acknowledge this in a recent speech in London.
And so we have to manage them, and they have to know that if you're in Singapore, please keep the bling down. Don't go around popping champagne, which is $20,000 a bottle, with sparklers. And don't zoom your Ferrari or Lotus or whatever down the middle of the road in the middle of the night just to let everybody know that you have arrived. You would have not thought that that was something you needed to tell anybody, but sometimes it's helpful to remind them.
Oh, ha 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 ha! So funny. Except when you talk to Singaporeans about Ferraris zooming down our streets, this is what we remember.
You're watching video of a horrific traffic accident in Singapore where a Ferrari plows into a taxi. 3 people dead in all.
3 people died in that crash, Mr. Lee. Why are you laughing? Your callous attitude is part of the problem. You don't understand our lives and how your economic policy has led to real suffering. The world's super wealthy buying up huge chunks of property drives up prices for Singaporeans, which adds to the current housing affordability crisis, which means some Singaporeans cannot afford to buy their own home. Opening up the labour market to foreign professionals who are willing to work for lower salaries has undermined the bargaining power of Singaporeans who are already vastly underpaid due to your government's policy of deliberate wage suppression. This is not a game of cards, Mr. Lee. This is our lives, our homes, our wages. And you're laughing? Your economic policy imports people to deliberately suppress the wages of Singaporeans. But you keep gaslighting us, telling us not to be xenophobic. But you shouldn't be surprised that people are angry when your government naturalizes foreigners as citizens very rapidly, sometimes as fast as 2 years, partly because you want their money, partly because you want to keep our wages low so your capitalist friends can make money, partly because you need more Chinese and Indians to keep racial ratios unchanged. In other words, all these reasons are for economic growth and PAP hegemony, not because of the actual needs of the people. The PAP government itself has been shocked by cultural differences. To the government's surprise, bus drivers recruited from China have gone on strike over mistreatment and low wages. But the PAP has long lectured Singaporeans that protesting and striking is un-Asian. That's nonsense, of course. The PRC government officially reported 87,000 protests in China in 2005, and academics estimate an average of 500 protests every day in China. It's a normal part of their radical tradition, which arose from the May 4th movement and Chinese communism. So Chinese is not just Chinese. What the PAP think is Chinese culture can be very different from the culture in the PRC. Even within China, Chineseness can be very different from north to south, east to west. A new citizen professional from Shanghai, a work permit holder from Gansu province, and a Singaporean of Chinese descent from Bukit Timah may all officially belong to the same racial group, but their experiences will be vastly different and not reflected in a simple categorization. Heck, they may not even be able to speak the same language. The Gansu native may even be Hui Muslim because that's the biggest minority group in that province and so have more in common with Singapore's Muslims. On the other hand, the Singaporean of Chinese descent will likely have far more in common with a locally born Indian or Malay, as they speak the same language, have gone to the same schools, eaten the same food, maybe even share the same religion. Race ultimately is deeply personal and contextual, and forcing the vast majority of Singapore into these racial boxes dehumanizes people and forces them to conform to a conception of race that may not in any way reflect their self-perception. And what does it matter anyway if we are 70% or 60% or 50% Chinese? Aren't we supposed to be building one united people regardless of race? So, is race mutable or immutable? Like, does race change over time, or is race always the same? Can you change your race or not? You know, the PAP can't decide, and that's the second problem. It keeps changing its mind on this to suit itself. There's a central contradiction in how the PAP government handles race. The government argues that we want to create a society where race doesn't matter, where we have a meritocracy. And at the same time, the policies it chooses to pursue further entrench race into the fabric of Singapore. It's actually a similar problem to Malaysia, where the country cannot make up its mind whether it's a country where all people have equal rights, or whether some races, religions, or royalty get to have more rights than others. In Malaysia, equality is like durian season. It's a prickly problem that comes around once every year, smells promising, and then everyone argues over who gets the best part. In Singapore, equality is more like a spreadsheet. You only get counted if you can fit into a box. But ultimately, both countries have the same problem. If you want to end racial discrimination, the leaders have to set an example. They also need to pass laws aiming for that end. They need to try and move society to a future where we do not discriminate based on race. But in both countries, instead, the governments explicitly discriminate on race for political gain. In Singapore, we not only force you to have a race, but then how you are treated by the government depends on your race. A government which explicitly discriminates based on race cannot then turn around and tell citizens not to discriminate based on race. Hey, do as I say, not as I do. But if the government frequently discriminates by race, why can't everyone else? The PAP government has sought to thread this needle by saying things like, oh, personal racial preferences are okay, but imposing them on others is not. But then the government itself imposes its racial preferences on the population through its policies by forcing them into a racial box not of their own choosing. So the PAP government says we must be pragmatic. Race is immutable. Race is sensitive. But then they force people to conform to identities that they don't want to be and silence you if you protest. For example, the PAP government had been redefining what Chinese means in Singapore for decades. Why? You guessed it. Economic growth and to keep the PAP in power. Economically, the PAP wanted to make Singaporean workers more exploitable by Western capital. So they wanted to force all Singaporeans to be able to speak English, which in the mid-1970s was still a minority language in Singapore. So they eventually forced all Chinese schools to switch to English. The Chinese schools were of course furious, so the PAP bought their silence with huge amounts of money. That's how we have the Special Assistance Plan or SAP schools. At the same time, the PAP wanted to keep Singaporeans compliant and voting PAP, so from the 1960s they redefined Chineseness away from the radical 20th century Kuomintang tradition of the May 4th movement towards pre-revolutionary ideas of Confucianism, which is of course almost the opposite of how China evolved after World War II. In fact, the Chinese Communist Party's radicalism would reach a peak with the Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 76. To be fair, Lee did not hide this in his National Day rally speech in 1978, where he was very clear the reason he was teaching Singaporeans Asian values was to prevent himself getting voted out. He knew it was a system that China itself had abandoned for good reason, but he didn't care.
You take a Western value system, it's my fundamental rights as a citizen. Under the Constitution, I'm guaranteed all these things. Now give me. You haven't given me, I'll vote you out. But the Chinese ethical system is a different one. You owe certain obligations to society. Mind you, when I say this, when I'm talking about the traditional classical value system, I'm not talking of the system today in China. The different programmed early from the age of 6 in school, you've got good citizens. If that's not programmed, you have a motley crowd.
So at the exact same time, the PAP are forcing on Singaporeans an idea of Chineseness that was bilingual or English speaking, pro-capitalist, that emphasize obedience to authority. In China, they were promoting an idea of Chineseness that was Chinese-speaking, anti-capitalist and communist, and radical, culminating in the Cultural Revolution. Now, all this may seem oversimplified, but it had real consequences. As we were about to film this, news broke that Tang Lianghong had passed away. In the 1990s, Tang struck a nerve with the PAP when he pointed out all this manipulation of Chinese identity and how superficial and shallow and not grounded in actual cultural tradition and history it was, and that the PAP government systematically discriminated against all non-English speakers. And for this crime of opposing the PAP government, they destroyed him and he had to flee into exile in Australia. So you see the fundamental problem. The PAP has forced their racial preferences on all of us for decades, often against the objections of those races. And then to keep us from being angry at them, they tell us to blame the other races. My point is not about what racial definition is right or wrong. My point is race in Singapore is not about race. It's about money and power. We come back to the PAP's overarching goals: economic growth and staying in power. And that is why we are unable to push back against this, because the PAP declares that any discussion of race is inherently dangerous and must be suppressed. This justifies the PAP state intervening deeply into society for anything that might possibly touch upon race in Singapore in order to avoid conflict. Only the PAP government is allowed to talk about race. This justifies silencing minorities or anyone who speaks out against institutional racism. That's why when a Singaporean makes unsubstantiated racial and religious claims that offer a way to attack the Workers' Party, the PAP condemns it again and again and again and again. But a foreigner who writes racially charged but pro-PAP articles?
Will the minister now apply those same standards to Michael Petraeus, the Polish national whose Critical Spectator platform has published racially charged commentary on Singapore politics?
There are a variety of people who have commentaries running on Singapore. The Economist comments on politics in Singapore. The New York Times runs articles on Singapore. The South China Morning Post runs articles on Singapore. And Michael Petraeus is not the only person who is a foreigner who runs commentaries. That doesn't amount to, within the definition, interfering with our local politics. If we took that definition, every day we'll be doing nothing but taking down and trying to object to various international journals. It's not the government's business to be going and censoring all of this.
Shan's example is terrible because the PAP government actually has sued or censored all those publications. But suddenly they can't sanction one man's personal blog? They sanctioned Kenneth Jayaranam's blog using POFMA'ed, but what about this guy? I think it's clear what the difference is. The fact is that the PAP engages in racial politics all the time. They just don't want any other party or person engaging in racial politics. But more fundamentally, what the PAP is arguing is that we, Singaporeans, are complete and utter idiots. That we don't know how to be sensitive or tactful or compassionate. It would rather reduce us to a state of fear and infantilize us and make us always turn to the PAP government to resolve our differences rather than doing it ourselves. Which is their point. In actual fact, of course, Singaporeans deal with racial differences on our own all the time, and we totally have the capacity to deal with conflict. What the government is actually more afraid of is losing control. And so it uses race as an issue to control us, arguing that if it does not do so, we will erupt and get into fights with each other. And this is the real lesson it took from the 1964 riots, which was, instead of saying, let's build a society where race doesn't matter, they decided instead to build a society where only the government can manipulate race for political purposes. And this has led to a really strange situation in Singapore where people who point out racism are punished more than people who are openly racist. Take Subhash Nair, who is basically what Shanmugam thinks he looks like when he looks in a mirror. Subhash spent 6 weeks in jail, not for driving Shan wild of envy, though that's true, but fundamentally because he first made a song criticizing a racist advertisement that had a Chinese man with brown face playing 4 different races. Then after getting warned, he refused to stay silent and continued posting comments online pointing out institutional racism and the double standards faced by minorities. When he was put on trial, the factual accuracy of his comments was not challenged. The prosecutor's argument was that he was guilty of promoting ill will regardless of the accuracy of his statements. He received a longer sentence than the punishment received by individuals such as Gan Huai-shi, Benjamin Koh, and Nicholas Lim, who all posted anti-Muslim or anti-Malay remarks online. The makers of the racist brown-face ad also only received a stern reminder for their ad. So if the people who are victims of racial discrimination cannot honestly speak out about their experience, then how would anyone know a problem exists? Which is PAP logic. If no one complains, then a problem does not exist.
I have not come across one single migrant worker himself that has demanded an apology.
So, race in the PAP Singapore is a lever they use to manipulate society for political benefit. That's why the GRC system is justified by race, even though GRCs actually discriminate against racial minorities, because a GRC dilutes minority votes within a Chinese majority and ensures that a minority representative can only be elected by a Chinese majority. As I've discussed before, there are so many better ways to ensure minority representation, but it's actually about preserving PAP political power. That's why the HDB ethnic integration policy is justified by race, even though it makes minorities poorer by making it harder for them to sell their flats. And it operates on the bizarre logic that a bloc that is 87% Chinese is not an ethnic enclave, whereas a bloc with 26% Malays is an ethnic enclave. Because again, it is about preserving PAP political power by spreading out minority voters. That's why the hiatus-triggered elected presidency makes no sense when you elect someone who, under all the standard rules, should be Indian, yet you elect them as Malay. And that's why you insist the Prime Minister must be Chinese, even though 80% of Singaporeans wanted an Indian and our first Chief Minister was a Jew. And that is why the PAP government is weaponizing race and using it to punish criticism so harshly. The fundamental source of conflict in Singapore today is economic exploitation, which is deeply destabilizing to society. And the PAP government cannot cope with this because they are the biggest exploiters of Singaporeans economically, so they have to resort to accusations of xenophobia and promoting ill will between races to silence criticisms. It's like if we got tired of only eating croissants and we protest having to always eat croissants. And in response, the PAP declares croissants as central to our national identity and force feeds us even more croissants and calls anyone who doesn't want to buy a croissant a racist and a xenophobe. But remember, it's not about the croissants, it's about the PAP's bakery making money. It's packed with imported customers and overworked and underpaid kitchen staff. Locals can barely afford a pastry, but sales are booming because capitalists are buying. That's what the PAP calls success. And if you don't like the croissant, don't worry. They'll just import 2 million new customers who do. Which is why I think maybe it's time we try a different bakery. So that's our show. And before you go, if you enjoy these videos and would like to see more of them, please do visit newnarrative.com/support to join New Narrative as a member or donate to New Narrative. As a member, you gain access to our website with all our wonderful articles, comics, videos, podcasts, and you can interact with like-minded people who are fighting for a better Southeast Asia, and you ensure that we make more of these videos for you. Thank you very much.